Hey everyone, it's Naomi Wolf with Daily Cloud, and I'm thrilled to be here with Charlotte Dennett, someone who's been an inspiration for me for a long time. Welcome, Charlotte.
Hey, Naomi, great to be with you.
Great. I want to tell you guys about this amazing book she's written, The Crash of Flight 3804, A Lost Spy, A Daughter's Quest, and the Deadly Politics of the Great Game for Oil. And her bio is extraordinary also. She's a former Middle East reporter, an investigative journalist, and an attorney. I met her in her role as the author of The People versus Bush, One Lawyer's Campaign to Bring the President to Justice, and the national grassroots movement she encounters along the way. And she wrote with her husband, Gerard Colby, Thy Will Be Done, The Conquest of the Amazon, Nelson Rockefeller, and Evangelism in the Age of Oil. And so we're talking about this extraordinary thriller, mystery, and also story, very moving story of a daughter's search for the truth about her father. So it's quite unbelievable. Let me start off by just asking Charlotte, who was your father?
My father was really America's only master spy in the Middle East at the time of his death in March of 1947. This is just after the end of the World War II. And he was, at that time, part of the Central Intelligence Group, which grew out of the Office of Strategic Services and was the precursor of the CIA, which was formed a couple of months after his death. So he was stationed in Beirut and was in charge of counterintelligence for the entire Middle East.
Wow,
and
wow.
I was born in Beirut. 6 weeks after I was born, he died in a plane crash, which is why the title of the book is that.
And so so I'm sorry for your loss. That's a really dramatic, beginning to anyone's life. A big tragedy early on in your life. What was he doing when the plane went down, and what led you to start asking questions about his death and the circumstances around it?
Well, I, of course, grew up not knowing my father, and I didn't ask too many questions while I was growing up. But eventually, after I was a reporter in the Middle East, I began to realize that I was following in his footsteps, so I wanted to know more. What I found out was by visiting the attic of our family and finding a steamer trunk, and in the steamer trunk I found lots of letters from him and his last report and his last letter home. And that's how I found out what he was up to, because my mother didn't talk about it. All I knew was he was a spy. What he was doing, he was trying to determine the route of the Trans-Arabian Pipeline. And this was a huge commercial venture, in fact, the biggest in American history, if you can believe that. And it was the construction of a 1,000-mile pipeline between the eastern shores of Saudi Arabia, where most of its oil is located, and stretched across the Arabian Peninsula. And it was to have a terminal point in either Lebanon or Palestine, which really caught my eye, because as we all know, those are areas of major conflict and have been for the past 7 decades.
Right. And so in this very moving and gripping story of how an adult daughter investigates and, finds old archives and talks to his spy colleagues, really elderly former spies, it's so fascinating. I mean, it'll make such a great movie. You also revealed, and it's very visually clear in the maps that really dot this book, that what we think of as enemies and geopolitics and crazy people who hate our freedoms is really pipeline after pipeline in those same trouble spots. Am I expressing this correctly? There are multiple maps like this in your book, and they show clearly how proposed pipelines brought entities into conflict with each other, how they created conflicts, and how really pipeline politics undergirds what you would say are conflicts in Syria, in Lebanon, in Israel, in Gaza. Am I summarizing that correctly?
Yeah, you did a great job.
Tell us about it.
That's the amazing thing. When I first looked at TAPline, the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, I learned about all the intrigues that were associated with it. And I describe it. It's a great article in the New York Times, March 2, 1947. And pipeline adds issues for the Middle East and for the U.S., and it addresses the issue of Russia. This is 1947. Well, anyway, years later, when I was beginning to investigate my father, and George W. Bush had sent troops to Afghanistan, and shortly after 9/11, then in 2003, sent troops to Iraq. I began to wonder whether there was a pipeline connection to either one of these conflicts, and lo and behold, I found them. And the more I started to look at these wars, then I started to apply my own, quote, pipeline consciousness to other wars, such as the so-called civil war in Syria. And I say so-called because to my mind, it was really a war to undermine the regime of Assad. And
because he didn't buy into letting a pipeline go through Syria, according to your argument, correct?
That is true. It's a matter of controversy, but I have come to the conclusion that that was a major factor in the U.S. ramping up its efforts to undermine him. And yeah, so there were two competing pipelines. One of them was going to go from Qatar, carrying natural gas, and it had to go through Syria, and he did not want that, primarily because the Russians didn't want it, because it would have competed with their sale of natural gas to Europe. And so that's all in the book. And then he developed a competing pipeline. It was called the Islamic Pipeline, and that was to carry natural gas from Iran. And that was okay to go through Syria. Iran was an ally at that point. So the whole point is this, oil is the fuel of the military, which most people don't realize. And if you aspire to be a major power in the world, or to keep that major power status, you need to have control over oil and gas. Mm-hmm. And that's why it gets so vicious, because you have competing governments and you have competing oil companies, and oil is useless unless it is distributed. And how do you distribute oil? Most times you initially have to do it through pipelines. Eventually it'll go into tankers. But then the question is, well, how do you run your pipelines? How do you make it safe for a certain territory to transverse the pipelines? And that's when it gets really nasty. And it has been particularly nasty in the Middle East.
So you would say, and it is completely eye-opening and really unforgettable. It's one of those things that once you've seen it, you can't unsee it, as the expression goes. Each of these maps and these pipelines, the proposed pipelines, literally map to a conflict. And it really makes sense that really doesn't make sense in terms of geopolitics. Like, why, and the narratives we have about, well, why is Lebanon in turmoil? Fanatics, why are those Gazans crazy and we have to subjugate them? Well, it's a port, right? So the whole narrative about Syria, the narratives about, even the nature of the conflict in the Middle East, when it flares up, when it doesn't flare up. I mean, it was so transparent that we were going to go to war with Syria for months and months and months before we went to war with Syria. And it absolutely felt like there was some other narrative that was not disclosed to us. You can't unsee these maps. It doesn't mean, it's a very provocative argument you're making. I'm not saying that this is the only answer. It's so complex, I can't possibly know, but you make an exhaustive study that leads one completely persuaded that there is a narrative beneath the narrative that has to do with natural gas and oil. I just want to point out one example that I'm persuaded by.
Yeah, be careful, because it comes out a little blurry, at least to my view.
Yeah,
hold it up.
people are not going to be able to see
Yeah,
that clearly. They'll have to look in your book,
sure.
or we can post links when we post this. But I was reporting on big names like Murdoch and the former Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney, investing in a gas company in the Golan Heights. And of course, there's been dispute over the Golan Heights forever. It's not necessary to Israel's security. Why are we there? Suddenly I realized why we were there. And I also, after 2014, started to report on a discovery of oil fields off the coast of Gaza. And there was this bombardment and subjugation of the people of Gaza at the same time that I found that there was a giant deal being made involving Egypt and France, and then, you know, Britain and the United States were upset that they weren't included in these newly discovered energy fields, the Leviathan, I think it was called, off the coast of Gaza. And so that made that completely out of the blue, totally kind of crazy and propagandized bombardment of innocent people really makes sense, because you needed, they weren't just killing people, they were leveling structures near the port. And I don't know what relationship that might have to transporting oil or exploiting those reserves. I thought you might know, but those two examples definitely jibed with my own reporting from 2014 to 2019, even before I read your book. What would you say about the Golan Heights and about Gaza specifically in relation to this theory?
Well, first of all, that's just amazing that it jived with your earlier reporting. Well, all I had to do, you know, it's very easy. All I had to do was, frankly, Google Gaza and pipelines.
Wow.
And there it was. There's the story. And it's the story of the Israelis not wanting Gaza to have any share in the massive natural gas findings off the coast.
That's right, because it's in Gazan territory.
Yeah, that's right. And the Gazans were able to hire experts to go in there and to determine the amount that was there. And I recall that Arafat, the head of the Palestine Liberation Organization, was saying, thank God, we are now going to have some economic security. Well, we know what happened to him. And there are actual quotes from Israeli commanders in my book who state, we are not going to let the Gazans get control over any of that gas or oil, because that would just support terrorism. And even quotes saying, we are going to destroy Gaza. I mean, it's just amazing.
Right. And it really came out of the blue. And what about the Golan Heights? And
the Golan Heights as well. No one talks about the oil connection there. But they're quietly drilling there. They think there's oil there. And the latest place is the West Bank. You know, there's been all sorts of talk about how they're going to annex the West Bank. And Palestinians say, look, we're already under occupation, so why are they doing this? Well, the unstated reason, I believe, is that there's oil there. That's not in the book because I just discovered it.
And let's talk about Afghanistan. What's the relationship of oil to the war in Afghanistan, which seems to go on and on with no, explainable connection to the United States of America at all?
Well, there's no oil in Afghanistan as far as we know, but Afghanistan, because of its geography, is a crucial transit country. Right. And there's massive oil and gas in the Caspian Sea, which attracted various energy companies after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That became sort of a free-for-all to get a hold of it. And so they wanted to run a pipeline that would go from Turkmenistan, then through Afghanistan, Pakistan, and on to India. It's called TAPI. Right. They're still working on it, and the reason it's not constructed is because of the ongoing conflict there. But I found energy experts saying that part of the reason for the fighting, the war in Afghanistan, is, quote unquote, so the energy can flow south.
Wow. Well,
And
to look at a map, it just seems so extraordinarily plausible. Otherwise, you really look at this geopolitical commitment of billions of dollars and American, young people's blood and treasure and U.S. treasure, and you think, what is it in this desolate, barren place that is so critical for us to be there and to never leave? And I married a veteran since I last spoke to you, and even people in the military who have served there don't pretend to have been given by their commanders an actual reason that makes sense to them for risking their lives in Afghanistan.
yeah,
So let's go on to, I have to ask this question, and I remember when I first talked to you about this years and years ago, this was a huge light bulb moment in my mind. And other people have made this case. You don't hear it in the United States so much, but I've seen people address this in Britain. Could Israel itself have been co-created by the British Empire, the state of Israel, as a way to protect interests related to oil and natural gas? Is that part of the very surprising sudden friendship of the gigantic superpower of Great Britain and this tiny little, country of despised refugees, which otherwise is also very hard to understand geopolitically?
it's a huge question, Naomi, and thanks for sort of posing it that way. Yeah, that's what I found out. What I do is I rely on chronology. It's a very simple tool. And you showed some maps there. There's a pipeline that ran from Iraq to Haifa, Palestine. It was built in the 30s. But what I found out is getting the oil of Iraq was conceived by the British before World War I.
Wow.
And they called it a first-class war aim. So they got the oil. And then, how do you get the oil out of the ground, and where do you ship it to? So it was logical. They were going to build a pipeline from Iraq that would terminate in Haifa. And then I started to look at 1917, and that was the year after the war that the famous Balfour Declaration was
Right.
made, and that was a letter from Lord Balfour, foreign minister, who knew all about oil at the time, and it was written to a Rothschild, Edward Rothschild, who was a huge scion of oil during that time. So, and since then, Israeli scholars are beginning to get through some declassified information that does show that having this little state with Northern Europeans, namely Jews who are refugees from the Holocaust, that would be perfect to have the terminal point in Palestine, so that they would feel a the British. And then later I started to figure out what was going to protect the Trans-Arabian pipeline that my father was involved in, and that was terminating in nearby Lebanon. And then I started to think, well, where is the protection of that pipeline? And it suddenly hit me one day. I started to look in Israel, and then I suddenly realized it's not that it's in Israel, it is Israel. Why is Israel backed up by billions of dollars of armaments ever since its creation in 48? So that is the backstory, and it's quite compelling.
Yeah, I need to react to that because a lot of people watching this will be like I was, kind of horrified and then compelled to think about what you just said or what we both just speculated. I just want to take a moment to to say to everyone watching, I'm Jewish, so it is completely not anti-Semitic to ask questions about. I mean, it's always baffled me how people who were being fed into ovens a year before, 2 years before, with huge efforts afoot to even save them from the Nazis that were very difficult in both Britain and America, suddenly turned into, well, let's give these people a state, right? These people who were complete waste people, according to the rest of the world, up till 2 years before that, who were, being turned away from ports all over the world. Let's give them a state. let's enshrine the state, let's dispossess other people who are there. And then when you look at, as we do at Daily Clout, the bills that go through Congress every year, there are billions and billions and billions of dollars going to Israel every year in ways that are kind of legally incontestable. Like, you can't change the law. It's written so that no one can challenge the money flowing in vast quantities to Israel. And you really kind of have to think, well, is this just that we really like this brave little country? Is it that it's our ally? The various mythologies or narratives that we get in America. And the only thing that has ever made sense to me about the creation of the state of Israel, when so many dispossessed people and refugees at that time could have also used their own homeland, right? The British colonial empire was not given to handing out nations in 1948, right? They didn't do it a lot. They suppressed nations, they occupied nations, they dispossessed people, right? This was like 20 years before the wave of nations getting their independence from Britain in the 1960s. So the fact that the most elevated people in Great Britain said, okay, stop the presses, we're going to make a nation right here, and then it turns out to map to Haifa, a departure point, right, for oil and gas, and then this other hotly contested possible departure point, which is now the center of so much oppression for no apparent reason. The way I felt, honestly, as a Jew, was used when I thought through this history. What I felt was our tragedy was cynically used and almost rebranded and exploited by the British Empire and other great powers as a mask or a band-aid to protect their access to oil. And our untold Jewish and Israeli lives and Palestinian lives were used up as fodder with this fake narrative of our people hating each other, which we hadn't, right? We lived in harmony for centuries in Palestine, to as a cover story for this, placing of Western influence in the middle of a bunch of oil fields and in the middle of a pipeline staging point. So that's how I felt. And I just want to really say that, because otherwise, for one to realize that there's a theory, and looking at the maps, it's so plausible that the state of Israel was founded to facilitate the extraction of oil by great powers is shocking to Jews and, like me.
Well, I gotta say, I've often spoken before Jewish audiences, and when I describe the oil connection, it's like, honestly, scales dropping from the eyes, because, they didn't realize it. It sort of made sense. And there's another angle to this as well. And that is, when it became known that Jews were being slaughtered in Germany, and the Holocaust was now validated. That was known by 1943. At the same time, the U.S. sent out crews, investigators, to see how Arabs would react to the idea of thousands of Jews coming to Palestine. And the one Arab who was definitely against it was Ibn Saud. I mean, there were even efforts by FDR to persuade him to become president of this new state, and he turned it down. And not only did he turn it down, but he threatened the U.S. that if you go ahead with this, your oil concessions are in danger. So what happened ultimately, though, is that Ibn Saud cut a deal with Roosevelt and said, you don't have to worry about the oil. So some kind of negotiation was made, and only this has come out very lately. So thanks to declassification of documents, we're finally getting at the truth. But it is shocking truth and very sad when you think of the millions of lives that have been lost during these past 7 decades. It's a terrible story. And I wrote this book hoping that it would end.
What kind of reaction have you had to this book? I mean, it's so jaw-dropping. I mean, first of all, you're talking about declassified documents, and you're talking about your dad, who was a spy. has the intelligence community, which is interesting how they refer to themselves, objected to what you're doing, supported what you're doing? Any blowback?
Well, it's really weird. There has not been blowback yet, as far as I know. Um, the reaction to my book has been universally wonderful. I mean, I'm totally amazed. Every single review has been great.
Oh,
But the intelligence community, most amazingly, it was a little over a year ago, I got a call from the CIA, and they told me that they decided they were going to honor my father as the fallen first star at because they have a wall with all the stars, all the agents that have died in the line of service, and they have a ceremony every year in front of the wall, and there's a book of honor where they place their names. And earlier, another CIA person had said, hey, this guy, this Dennett, he was really quite an amazing, interesting person, and he should be included, even though he died 2 months before the CIA was actually created. And so they finally came around, and I'm not sure why. It may have been because they got wind I was writing a book and hoped that I would go gently on the CIA. It may have been that. But anyway, they invited me and my family, and we went there, and we were treated very decently and feted with a wonderful feast. And we were told my father was going to be a role model for officers. And yeah, it was nice. I even got to have a private audience with Gina Haspel, the director.
Wow.
And I was able to ask her to declassify more documents, and she said she would do it. And by gosh, she did.
It's amazing.
So, yeah. So one of the documents I wanted declassified was a early 44 document written by my father called An Analysis of Work, and it laid out what was expected of him. And the most important thing that comes through this document, which I was already pretty much able to figure out despite massive redactions, was that his enemies, when he was sent there in 44, were not the Germans. They were the French, the British, and the Russians. In other words, my father's job was to spy on our former allies during, and it was all about oil. And there was this one great line that they forgot to redact, where he was talking about the oil of Saudi Arabia, and it said, that oil is so important, we must protect it at all costs.
Wow.
So I take at all costs and extend it all the way up to the present. And what have the costs been?
Well, one of the costs is the loss of your father's life, and I thank him for his service. I mean, it's very easy on the left to, demonize everyone in intelligence, and there are a lot of excesses, God knows. But if you really think long and hard about what nation states need to survive, they need intelligence, ethical intelligence, intelligence with oversight congressionally, ideally, of course. But your father died in service of his country. He didn't make oil policy. He was following orders and doing his job. And I'm sorry for your loss. Here's a question about your father's death. He died in a country that was not Saudi Arabia or anywhere else he was stationed. Why was that? What's your understanding about why his plane crashed?
Right, because after his top secret mission to Saudi Arabia to determine the route of the pipeline, he went to Ethiopia. And the reason that he was headed for Ethiopia is that the U.S. had another exclusive oil concession with Ethiopia and its ruler, Haile Selassie, who very much wanted to team up with the Americans. He was sick and tired of being totally restricted by the British. They had control over every aspect of Ethiopian life, including its roads, its railroads, its airspace, its communications. And so in 1945, the U.S. began reaching out to him, and in line with an oil concession to Sinclair Oil, an American oil company. So he gave the concession, and then the U.S. wanted to send over communications equipment that would help them develop a Ethiopian Airlines, which would be owned by Ethiopia, but run and managed by TWA. And one of the things I found out is that in 1945, when the U.S. first sent a guy over there, he got on a plane in Asmara, which is right next to Ethiopia, headed for Ethiopia, and it crashed. And it was following the same route that my father's plane followed 2 years later. There were 5 men on board the plane, and one of them was the petroleum attaché, and another one was a communications specialist. And when the plane was, after the plane crash was discovered, took 2 days before the U.S. was formally notified. The first people there to survey the plane crash were the British. And so I have to say that I theorize that it's quite possible that it was the British that were behind the plane crash. They were very jealous at this time of American making inroads on their empire.
Our allies, our allies. Good Lord. What a story. I'm so sorry. What a tragedy. And how, again, another unnecessary death, right? Because of oil politics.
Well, to me, what makes it a tragedy is that my father was an Islamic scholar. And he could speak the language, he knew the Quran, he wrote about early Islam. His books are still being read. And so he had deep sensitivity to that part of the world. And that's missing from today, even from espionage. I think that's why the CIA is honoring him. I don't know if they can ever revert back to the time when analysis is what prevailed. He was not, as far as I know, involved in covert operations. That happened just around the time of his death. Right. But at any rate, so to me, that's what makes it particularly tragic. Yeah. I didn't know him. I think it was probably harder on my brother and sister who knew him and suffered the loss even more.
Of course. Well, what an extraordinary story. Of course, it has to be a movie, as I mentioned. And
I love that. I mean, you say that, but I don't know who's going to make it a movie.
Let's make it happen. Well, look, we could talk for hours about this. Everyone rush out and buy it. Say the title and the subtitle one more time, and then I'll tell people where to get it.
Okay. The Crash of Flight 3804. A Lost Spy, a Daughter's Quest, and the Deadly Politics of the Great Game for Oil.
Absolutely. And please go to Chelsea Green, which is our amazing mission-driven publisher, to order immediately. Let's get it on every bestseller list in the country and internationally. It's one of the most important books. I mean, honestly, it's one of the most important books I've read as someone who cares about geopolitics, as a Jew, as a human being. It's one of the most important books I've read. And, this terrible tragedy, by working so hard, you've turned it into something that may open a lot of people's eyes and maybe may save lives in the future. So Charlotte Dennett, thank you so much. This is Naomi Wolf at Daily Clout, and the book is The Crash
of Flight 3804.
And do not miss it. We'll see you again, Charlotte. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Naomi.
Take care.